Within the high-stakes environment of a recent congressional assembly, Senator Fisher, a prominent Republican legislator representing the state of Nebraska, engaged in a rigorous examination regarding the multifaceted economic ramifications of federal trade mandates and tariff structures on her local constituency. This dialogue, featuring direct inquiries to Ambassador Greer, served as a critical platform to dissect how national protectionist strategies often intersect with the practical realities of Middle America. Senator Fisher articulated a nuanced perspective, acknowledging that while the overarching goal of such policies is to fortify the domestic industrial base, the immediate fallout frequently lands on the shoulders of those least equipped to absorb the shock. She posited that the current fiscal environment necessitates a sophisticated understanding of how global market fluctuations dictate the livelihoods of individual producers. By framing the discussion through the lens of her voters, Senator Fisher underscored the necessity for a policy framework that is both protective and pragmatically sustainable for the long term. Despite her recognition of the indispensable nature of government subsidies for agricultural entities currently grappling with exorbitant operational expenses, Senator Fisher pointedly observed to Ambassador Greer that such financial interventions are merely temporary palliatives rather than permanent solutions. The senator emphasized that the core ambition of agricultural producers is not to remain tethered to federal assistance, but rather to secure a predictable and transparent marketplace for their commodities. This distinction is vital in the broader context of American economic philosophy, where self-reliance is valued over state dependence. Senator Fisher argued that the reliance on aid packages is an indicator of a malfunctioning trade ecosystem that fails to honor the productivity of the American farmer. Consequently, the conversation with Ambassador Greer shifted toward the fundamental requirement for structural reforms that prioritize market access over compensatory payments. In this context, the primary objective remains the achievement of consistent market entry points and the rigorous enforcement of international trade obligations, specifically concerning China's previous commitments to large-scale soybean acquisitions. Senator Fisher's insistence on this point reflects a broader concern regarding the credibility of global trade agreements and the necessity of holding foreign powers accountable to their contractual promises. She noted to Ambassador Greer that for the agricultural sector to thrive, there must be a verifiable adherence to the Phase 1 trade deal or any subsequent iterations thereof. The failure to realize these purchase targets does not just affect the balance of trade, it directly undermines the financial planning and stability of family farms across the Great Plains. Therefore, the demand for accountability is not merely a political posture but a requisite for economic survival in a globalized world. The ensuing discourse between Senator Fisher and Ambassador Greer shed light on the stark disparities currently manifesting within the manufacturing landscape, where profound divergence in fortune is becoming increasingly evident across different industrial niches. While certain sectors have managed to harness the current economic climate to achieve unprecedented growth and expansion, others find themselves besieged by a confluence of negative variables. This economic balkanization suggests that the impact of tariffs is far from uniform, creating a scenario where one industry's protection is another's peril. Senator Fisher highlighted how companies integrated into global supply chains are experiencing a radical shift in their profit margins and operational viability. This contrast serves as a sobering reminder that federal interventions often produce winners and losers within the same domestic economy. Specifically, numerous industries are currently navigating a treacherous path characterized by intense fiscal strain and the looming specter of workforce reductions triggered by the skyrocketing costs of essential raw materials. When the price of steel, aluminum, or specialized components rises due to import duties, the downstream effects are felt immediately in the form of diminished competitiveness. Senator Fisher articulated the concerns of business owners who fear that the very policies designed to shield them are instead accelerating their decline. Ambassador Greer was presented with the reality of enterprises forced to make agonizing decisions between maintaining their labor force and preserving their solvency in an environment where overhead is becoming unmanageable. Such pressures illustrate the volatility inherent in using trade barriers as a blunt instrument of economic policy without considering the intricate dependencies of modern production. Notwithstanding these formidable obstacles, the dialogue also pivoted toward the latent potential for economic revitalization through strategically aligned foreign investment partnerships. Senator Fisher and Ambassador Greer explored how attracting international capital could serve as a catalyst for bolstering domestic supply chains and reducing reliance on adversarial nations. By encouraging foreign firms to establish manufacturing footprints within the United States, the government can facilitate a more resilient and self-sufficient industrial ecosystem. This approach suggests a paradigm shift from isolationism toward a form of collaborative domesticism, where global resources are leveraged to enhance local capacity. Senator Fisher noted that such investments could provide the necessary infrastructure to insulate the American economy from future global disruptions. These partnerships are envisioned as a mechanism to reinforce the internal architecture of the national supply chain, ensuring that critical components are produced and sourced within domestic borders. The recent vulnerabilities exposed by global crises have made it abundantly clear that a fragmented supply chain is a national security risk. Therefore, the focus on domesticating production through a mix of policy incentives and foreign collaboration is seen as a strategic imperative. Senator Fisher argued that by strengthening these links, the United States can reclaim its position as a global manufacturing powerhouse while fostering regional economic development. This strategy aims to create a virtuous cycle of investment, job creation, and technological advancement that benefits both local communities and the broader national interest. Ultimately, the exchange between Senator Fisher and Ambassador Greer provided a vivid illustration of the delicate and often precarious balance required to utilize protective tariffs effectively. The goal is to nurture and advance national industries without inadvertently imposing a competitive disadvantage on the very local businesses that form the backbone of the economy. It is a tightrope walk between asserting national sovereignty in trade and maintaining the fluidity required for businesses to compete on a global stage. The discussion underscored the fact that trade policy is not a static set of rules but a dynamic negotiation that must be constantly refined to reflect changing realities. Finding the Goldilocks zone of protection, where domestic firms are shielded from unfair practices but not strangled by increased input costs, remains the central challenge for contemporary policymakers. As the hearing progressed, it became clear that the debate is not just about numbers and trade balances, but about the fundamental vision of the American economy in the 21st century. There is a palpable tension between the desire for a robust, independent industrial sector and the reality of a world that is more interconnected than ever before. Senator Fisher's inquiries reflected the anxieties of a constituency that feels caught in the middle of these tectonic shifts. Her questions to Ambassador Greer sought to bridge the gap between high-level geopolitical strategy and the kitchen table economics of Nebraska's working families. This dialogue reinforces the idea that for a trade policy to be successful, it must be as sophisticated as the global markets it seeks to regulate. The complexity of these issues demands a level of analytical rigor that moves beyond partisan talking points and addresses the structural contradictions of the modern era. By examining the unintended consequences of tariffs on small to mid-sized enterprises, the hearing brought to light the human element of economic theory. It served as a reminder that every percentage point change in a duty rate translates into real-world impacts on employment, investment, and community stability. Moving forward, the insights garnered from the exchange between Senator Fisher and Ambassador Greer will likely inform the ongoing debate over how the United States should position itself against rising economic competitors. The pursuit of a balanced trade agenda continues to be one of the most pressing and contentious tasks facing the federal government today. In the rigorous continuation of the legislative session, Senator Fisher directed the focus of the Assembly toward the empirical data surrounding agricultural export fluctuations. She challenged Ambassador Greer to provide a more granular justification for the existing tariff enforcement mechanisms that appear to be yielding diminishing returns for Midwestern soy producers. The senator posited that the administrative burden of navigating these trade barriers often outweighs the theoretical benefits of market protection. This prompted a deep dive into the operational realities of Nebraska's agricultural corridors, where the volatility of international relations is felt at the farm gate level. Senator Fisher's line of questioning suggested that the federal government must prioritize the restoration of market normalcy over the continuation of reactive fiscal measures. Ambassador Greer, in turn, defended the administration's stance by characterizing these measures as necessary leverage in a broader geopolitical struggle for economic dominance. The dialogue then transitioned into a sophisticated debate over the mechanics of reciprocal trade and its long-term viability in a post-globalization era. Senator Fisher questioned whether the current trajectory of tariff escalation could lead to a permanent restructuring of global supply chains that excludes American producers. She expressed profound concern that while the United States focuses on domestic fortification, international competitors are rapidly filling the void left by American exports in Asian markets. This potential for market displacement represents a long-term threat to the structural integrity of the U.S. agricultural sector. Ambassador Greer was asked to clarify how the Department of Trade intends to mitigate the risk of long-term buyer fatigue among traditional trading partners. The exchange highlighted the inherent tension between short-term political objectives and the enduring necessity of maintaining a competitive edge in global commodity markets. Senator Fisher further explored the granular impact of these policies on the burgeoning tech agriculture sector, where high-tech machinery relies on imported components. She noted that the imposition of tariffs on specialized electronic sensors and precision components has created a paradoxical situation for modern farmers. While the government encourages the adoption of AG tech to increase efficiency, its trade policies simultaneously inflate the cost of the very technology required to achieve that efficiency. This contradiction, according to Senator Fisher, creates a barrier to entry for younger generations of farmers who must operate on razor-thin margins. Ambassador Greer responded by emphasizing the administration's commitment to reshoring the production of these high-tech components. However, the senator remained skeptical about the timeline for such a massive industrial transition and the immediate survival of local enterprises. The conversation then broadened to include the systemic risks posed by the retaliatory measures adopted by foreign governments in response to American protectionism. Senator Fisher pointed out that the agricultural heartland often bears the brunt of these retaliatory strikes, serving as a convenient target for foreign adversaries seeking to exert political pressure. She asked Ambassador Greer to provide a comprehensive strategy for protecting these vulnerable sectors from becoming pawns in a larger trade war. The senator's advocacy for a security-first trade model emphasizes the need for a defensive perimeter that shields domestic producers from external economic aggression. This requires a shift from purely offensive trade maneuvers to a more holistic approach that integrates national security with economic resilience. The dialogue underscored the fact that trade policy is no longer a separate domain but is inextricably linked to the broader national defense strategy. As the discussion deepened, Senator Fisher raised the issue of regulatory capture within the context of tariff exemptions and how smaller firms are often sidelined. She argued that large corporations possess the legal and financial resources to navigate the complex exemption process, while family-owned businesses in Nebraska are left to struggle with the full weight of the duties. This disparity, she noted to Ambassador Greer, creates an unlevel playing field within the domestic market itself. The senator demanded greater transparency in the criteria used to grant these exemptions, ensuring that the process is not biased toward well-connected industrial giants. Ambassador Greer acknowledged the need for administrative reform but maintained that the current system is designed to prioritize industries of strategic national importance. This led to a contentious debate over who gets to define what is strategic and whether the agricultural sector is being undervalued in that assessment. Moving into the realm of infrastructure, Senator Fisher linked the success of trade policies to the modernization of domestic logistics networks. She contended that tariffs on raw materials like steel and concrete are inadvertently driving up the costs of essential public works projects in rural America. Bridges, silos, and transportation hubs that are critical for moving goods to market are becoming increasingly expensive to maintain and expand. Senator Fisher asked Ambassador Greer how the administration plans to reconcile its Buy American mandates with the reality of inflated material costs caused by trade restrictions. The senator's point was clear. A trade policy that hinders the development of domestic infrastructure is ultimately self-defeating. She advocated for a more integrated policy approach that considers the total cost of ownership for national developmental projects. The debate also touched upon the philosophical divide regarding the role of the state in managing market outcomes. Senator Fisher expressed a preference for a market-driven approach, where the government's role is to facilitate competition rather than pick winners through tax and tariff codes. She cautioned Ambassador Greer against the dangers of industrial policy that mimics the state-led models of the very adversaries the U.S. is trying to counter. The senator argued that America's greatest strength is its entrepreneurial dynamism, which flourishes best in an environment of low barriers and high predictability. This part of the exchange highlighted a fundamental disagreement on the future of American capitalism in an increasingly mercantilist world. Senator Fisher's stance represents a call for a return to classical liberal trade principles, albeit tempered by modern security concerns. Furthermore, the senator brought attention to the psychological impact of trade uncertainty on the investment climate in the Midwest. She noted that many agricultural and manufacturing firms have paused their expansion plans due to the unpredictability of federal trade directives. Ambassador Greer was challenged to provide a roadmap of stability that would allow businesses to plan for the next 5 to 10 years without the constant threat of sudden policy pivots. Senator Fisher emphasized that capital is a coward and will flee to more predictable environments if the U.S. continues to operate on a cycle of emergency orders and executive whims. The need for a codified, legislative-led trade strategy was a recurring theme in her critique of the current administrative overreach. This led to a discussion on the importance of reasserting congressional authority over trade matters to ensure a more balanced and deliberative process. In addressing the human cost of these economic shifts, Senator Fisher spoke about the erosion of community stability in towns that rely on a single large manufacturer or a cluster of farms. When these entities face financial distress due to trade-induced cost increases, the ripple effect extends to local schools, hospitals, and small retailers. She urged Ambassador Greer to look beyond the macroeconomic indicators and see the lived reality of these forgotten communities. The senator's focus on the socioeconomic fabric of Nebraska provided a stark contrast to the abstract geopolitical theories often discussed in Washington. She argued that a trade policy that does not preserve the social contract with American workers is a failure, regardless of what the balance of trade looks like on paper. This segment of the hearing underscored the ethical dimensions of economic governance. Finally, the exchange between Senator Fisher and Ambassador Greer turned toward the future of trade in a decarbonizing world. The senator questioned how emerging environmental regulations might be used as stealth tariffs to further complicate the trade landscape. She expressed concern that carbon border adjustments could become another layer of bureaucracy that penalizes American producers who are already operating under strict environmental standards. Ambassador Greer defended the integration of climate goals into trade policy as a necessary step for global leadership. However, Senator Fisher remained wary of how these green mandates might be weaponized against the traditional energy and agricultural sectors of the Great Plains. The discussion concluded with a consensus that the path forward requires a delicate synthesis of economic, environmental, and national security priorities. As the deliberation entered its third hour, Senator Fisher pivoted the focus toward the intricate vulnerabilities inherent in the contemporary global supply chain, specifically as they pertain to the Midwest's industrial output. She confronted Ambassador Greer with the reality that onshoring is not merely a political slogan but a massive logistical undertaking that requires significant lead time and capital. The senator argued that current tariff policies, while intended to punish external competitors, are inadvertently acting as a tax on the innovation of American manufacturers who require global inputs to build local products. She questioned the ambassador on whether the administration had conducted a thorough cost-benefit analysis of how these duties affect the value-added sectors of the Nebraska economy. Senator Fisher pointed out that by increasing the cost of raw materials, the federal government might be hollowing out the very manufacturing base it seeks to protect. Ambassador Greer responded by framing these costs as a transition premium necessary to decouple the American economy from unreliable and often hostile foreign sources. The exchange then delved into the strategic importance of rare earth minerals and specialized chemical precursors, which are essential for both the agricultural and defense industries. Senator Fisher expressed deep skepticism regarding the speed at which domestic alternatives could be scaled to meet current demand. She pressed Ambassador Greer for specific timelines on when Nebraskan industries could expect a stabilization of input prices as new supply lines are established. The senator noted that without a clear transition plan, local businesses are being asked to hold their breath indefinitely while the government experiments with trade architecture. This led to a sophisticated discussion on the role of friendshoring, the practice of rerouting supply chains through allied nations, as a middle ground between total isolation and risky globalism. Senator Fisher urged the ambassador to prioritize these diplomatic channels to ensure that Nebraska's producers are not left in a resource vacuum during this period of geopolitical realignment. The dialogue further explored the concept of economic sovereignty versus economic efficiency, a central theme in the Fisher-Greer debate. Senator Fisher argued that for decades, the United States prioritized efficiency and low costs, which led to the outsourcing of critical capacities. However, she cautioned that the swing towards sovereignty must be tempered with the reality of market dynamics. She challenged Ambassador Greer to explain how the administration plans to maintain the global competitiveness of American exports if the cost of production continues to rise relative to international peers. The senator highlighted the risk of stagflation within the agricultural sector, where input costs rise while commodity prices remain stagnant due to market access barriers. This economic pincer movement, she contended, is the greatest threat to the solvency of independent farmers. Ambassador Greer countered by suggesting that true sovereignty requires the ability to produce essential goods regardless of the global political climate, even if it comes at a higher initial price point. Senator Fisher then turned her attention to the digital dimensions of trade, specifically the role of data sovereignty and the export of American AG tech intellectual property. She voiced concerns that as trade tensions escalate, the protection of proprietary data and agricultural patents becomes increasingly difficult in foreign jurisdictions. She asked Ambassador Greer how the Department of Trade is working to ensure that Nebraska's technological innovations are not being systematically harvested by competitors who ignore international patent laws. The senator emphasized that the soybean battle is only one front in a much larger war over the intellectual property that will define the next century of food production. She advocated for a trade policy that is as much about protecting American brains as it is about protecting American brawn. This segment of the hearing underscored the shift from traditional commodity trade to the high-stakes world of digital and technological competition. The conversation grew increasingly technical as Senator Fisher examined the rule of origin requirements and their impact on cross-border manufacturing with partners like Canada and Mexico. She pointed out that overly stringent requirements can stifle the North American trade ecosystem, which is vital for the automotive and heavy machinery industries in the region. Senator Fisher urged Ambassador Greer to seek a balance that prevents backdoor imports from adversaries while maintaining the fluidity of the USMCA agreement. She noted that for many Nebraska businesses, the integration with North American neighbors is just as critical as domestic sales. The senator's line of questioning suggested that a Fortress America approach might inadvertently damage the very regional alliances that provide the best counterweight to rising global rivals. Ambassador Greer acknowledged the complexity of these trilateral dynamics, but insisted that rigorous enforcement is the only way to prevent the erosion of the domestic industrial core. Moving into the realm of financial stability, Senator Fisher raised the issue of currency manipulation and its role as a hidden tariff that undermines American exports. She asked Ambassador Greer whether the administration is prepared to use more aggressive monetary tools to counter nations that artificially devalue their currency to gain a trade advantage. The senator argued that no amount of traditional tariff protection can offset the impact of a significantly undervalued foreign currency. This part of the exchange highlighted the need for a more synchronized approach between the Treasury Department and the Office of the Trade Representative. Senator Fisher's advocacy for a total economic defense strategy reflects a modern understanding of how trade, finance, and technology are interconnected in the global arena. She pushed for a more holistic view of trade that moves beyond simple import-export balances to include the broader financial landscape. Senator Fisher also addressed the social cost of trade volatility, focusing on the mental health and community well-being of rural populations. She shared anecdotes of family farms that have been in operation for generations but are now facing liquidation due to the unpredictable nature of trade-related debt. She challenged Ambassador Greer to see the human faces behind the trade statistics and to consider the long-term demographic shifts that occur when rural opportunities vanish. The senator argued that the preservation of the American rural way of life is a matter of national interest that transcends pure economic calculation. She called for a trade policy that includes impact mitigation strategies to support communities during periods of intense restructuring. This ethical appeal served to ground the high-level policy debate in the lived experience of her constituents, highlighting the profound responsibility of federal officials to their fellow citizens. Furthermore, the discussion touched upon the role of international organizations like the World Trade Organization, WTO, and whether they remain relevant in an era of bilateral power politics. Senator Fisher expressed skepticism regarding the efficacy of the WTO's dispute settlement mechanisms, which often take years to reach a conclusion while American industries suffer. She asked Ambassador Greer if it is time for the United States to lead the creation of a new coalition of the willing trade body that prioritizes fair competition among democratic nations. The senator's suggestion for a values-based trade system represents a radical departure from the post-WWI consensus, but reflects the growing frustration with global institutions that seem unable to address the challenges of the 21st century. Ambassador Greer responded cautiously, noting the administration's preference for reform from within, while acknowledging the validity of the senator's frustrations. As the session progressed, Senator Fisher also highlighted the intersection of trade policy and environmental stewardship. She noted that Nebraskan farmers are among the most efficient and environmentally conscious in the world, yet they are often penalized by global trade rules that do not account for these hidden benefits. She urged Ambassador Greer to pursue trade agreements that recognize and reward the lower carbon footprint of American agricultural products compared to those from regions with high deforestation rates. The senator's vision is one where trade policy becomes a tool for promoting high standards globally, rather than a race to the bottom. She argued that leveling the playing field must include environmental and labor standards to ensure that American workers are not competing against exploited labor and unregulated pollution. The final segment of this part of the hearing focused on the necessity of policy predictability. Senator Fisher emphasized that the greatest enemy of economic growth is not high taxes or even tariffs, but uncertainty. She called on Ambassador Greer to move away from Twitter diplomacy and ad hoc trade announcements in favor of a codified, bipartisan trade strategy that can survive multiple administrations. The senator noted that businesses in Nebraska need to know what the rules of the game will be 5 years from now to make the necessary investments in equipment and personnel. This demand for a return to normalcy in trade governance was perhaps her most resonant point, highlighting the deep desire for a stable environment where hard work and innovation, not political connections, determine success. The dialogue concluded with a commitment from both parties to continue exploring these complex issues with the gravity they deserve. As the congressional inquiry shifted into its more technical phase, Senator Fisher began to dissect the administrative complexities of the current tariff exclusion process, a topic of intense concern for many small-scale manufacturers in Nebraska. She pressed Ambassador Greer on the lack of clarity regarding how certain components are deemed essential, while others are subjected to punitive duties that threaten the solvency of local businesses. The senator argued that the current bureaucratic framework creates an information asymmetry, where only the largest corporations can afford the legal counsel necessary to navigate the petition process. She demanded that Ambassador Greer provide a roadmap for simplifying these procedures to ensure that Main Street enterprises are not marginalized by K Street lobbying power. This line of questioning highlighted a fundamental concern about the equitable application of trade law and the potential for federal policy to inadvertently favor industrial monopolies over decentralized competition. The discussion then moved toward the broader impact of trade restrictions on the American consumer's purchasing power, a subject that Senator Fisher addressed with considerable gravity. She noted that while the primary focus of trade debate is often on producers, the secondary effect is a regressive tax on everyday goods that hits low-income families the hardest. Senator Fisher asked Ambassador Greer to reconcile the administration's stated goal of supporting the working class with the reality of inflated prices for everything from appliances to automotive parts. She argued that a trade policy that builds walls around the country may also be building a ceiling on the standard of living for her constituents. This sparked a debate on the consumer-producer paradox, where the short-term gains of protected industries are weighed against the long-term inflationary pressures felt by the general public. Senator Fisher urged a more holistic accounting of these costs to ensure that trade wins are not actually net losses for the national economy. Senator Fisher then turned her attention to the specific challenges of the livestock industry, a cornerstone of Nebraska's economy that is particularly sensitive to fluctuations in feed costs and international export quotas. She challenged Ambassador Greer on the administration's strategy for handling sanitary and phytosanitary (SPS) barriers that are often used by foreign nations as a pretext for protectionism. The senator emphasized that for Nebraska's cattlemen, market access is not just about the absence of tariffs, but about the removal of non-scientific regulatory hurdles that block American beef from entering premium global markets. She asked for a commitment from the ambassador to elevate these technical trade issues to the highest levels of diplomatic engagement. Senator Fisher's advocacy in this area reflects a deep understanding of the invisible barriers that can be just as damaging to trade as high-profile duties and quotas. The conversation grew increasingly nuanced as they explored the role of export credit agencies and federal financing in supporting American competitiveness abroad. Senator Fisher questioned whether the United States is doing enough to match the aggressive financing packages offered by foreign governments to their national champions. She asked Ambassador Greer how the Department of Trade plans to empower the Export-Import Bank and other financial institutions to provide the necessary capital for Nebraska's exporters to compete on a level playing field. However, she also cautioned against the risks of crony capitalism, where government-backed loans are used to prop up inefficient industries at the expense of the taxpayer. The senator's position was one of strategic support, advocating for a financial architecture that rewards innovation and efficiency rather than mere political alignment. This segment underscored the growing importance of geofinance as a tool of modern statecraft. Another critical point of contention was the impact of trade policy on the domestic labor market and the skills gap that exists in the manufacturing sector. Senator Fisher observed that while tariffs are intended to bring jobs back to the United States, those jobs often remain unfilled due to a lack of specialized vocational training. She asked Ambassador Greer how the administration is coordinating trade policy with workforce development initiatives to ensure that Nebraska's labor force is ready for the onshored industries of the future. The senator argued that without a parallel investment in human capital, trade protectionism is a hollow gesture that fails to address the underlying structural weaknesses of the American economy. She proposed a Trade and Training Integration Act that would link tariff revenues directly to technical education programs in rural communities. This holistic approach seeks to transform trade policy from a purely defensive measure into a proactive engine for social and economic mobility. Senator Fisher also raised the issue of transshipment, the practice where foreign goods are routed through third-party countries to avoid American duties. She expressed concern that current enforcement mechanisms are insufficient to catch these trade chameleons, and that the integrity of the U.S. customs border is being compromised. She asked Ambassador Greer for a detailed report on the use of advanced tracking technologies and data analytics to identify and penalize these fraudulent practices. The senator noted that for every illegal import that slips through, an honest Nebraska manufacturer is put at a competitive disadvantage. Her demand for rule of law in trade reflects a broader commitment to ensuring that the global marketplace operates on the basis of merit rather than deception. This part of the exchange highlighted the cat-and-mouse game that defines modern trade enforcement and the need for constant technological adaptation. Furthermore, the dialogue touched upon the strategic importance of the energy sector and how trade policies affect the export of American liquefied natural gas, LNG, and renewable energy technologies. Senator Fisher argued that American energy dominance is a powerful tool for diplomatic leverage, and that trade barriers on energy components could undermine this strategic asset. She asked Ambassador Greer to explain how the administration plans to insulate the energy supply chain from the volatility of broader trade disputes. The senator emphasized that Nebraska's growing wind and solar sectors rely on a steady flow of specialized parts that are currently subject to high tariffs. She cautioned that green sovereignty should not come at the cost of energy affordability, urging a balanced approach that promotes domestic production without stifling the transition to a more diverse energy mix. As the hearing moved toward its conclusion for the day, Senator Fisher addressed the geopolitical alignment of trade partners, questioning the wisdom of relying on a few large markets. She advocated for a diversification strategy that would see the United States aggressively pursue trade agreements with emerging economies in Africa, Southeast Asia, and South America. She asked Ambassador Greer if the administration is doing enough to open these frontier markets for American agricultural and manufactured goods. Senator Fisher noted that as the global population shifts, The demand for high-quality American protein and technology will increasingly come from these burgeoning regions. By securing early mover advantages in these markets, the US can reduce its dependence on any single adversarial nation and create a more resilient global trade network. The senator also revisited the theme of legislative oversight, arguing that the current executive-heavy approach to trade policy has created a lack of institutional memory and consistency. She called for the re-establishment of a more robust role for the Senate Finance Committee in the negotiation and approval of trade agreements. Senator Fisher emphasized that for trade policy to have the consent of the governed, it must be debated and ratified by the representatives of the people, not just decreed from the Oval Office. This constitutional argument resonated with the audience, reflecting a growing desire for a return to the checks and balances that define the American system of government. She concluded this portion of the hearing by reminding Ambassador Greer that her primary duty is to the citizens of Nebraska, whose livelihoods are the true stakes of this complex geopolitical game. Finally, the exchange turned to the soft power implications of trade, with Senator Fisher noting that American exports are often the first point of contact between the United States and the rest of the world. She argued that when the US retreats from global trade, it cedes more than just market share, it cedes cultural and political influence. She asked Ambassador Greer how the administration plans to maintain the American brand in a world that increasingly sees the US as a protectionist and inward-looking power. The senator's vision is for a United States that is confident and open, a nation that protects its interests without sacrificing its leadership on the global stage. This philosophical reflection provided a powerful end to the day's deliberations, leaving both participants and observers with much to consider regarding the future of the American experiment in a changing world order. As the deliberation reached its final and most critical phase, Senator Fisher directed the focus toward the long-term institutional stability of American trade architecture, specifically questioning Ambassador Greer on the sustainability of using executive orders to bypass legislative consensus. The senator argued that the era of trade by decree has created a climate of profound uncertainty that paralyzes the long-term investment strategies of Nebraska's agricultural and manufacturing sectors. She posited that for the United States to maintain its global leadership, its trade policies must be rooted in the enduring legitimacy of congressional approval rather than the shifting whims of successive administrations. This led to a sophisticated examination of the Trade Promotion Authority, TPA, and whether the current executive overreach has fundamentally broken the social contract between the federal government and the rural constituencies it claims to protect. Senator Fisher's insistence on a return to constitutional norms served as a stark reminder that economic policy is inseparable from the democratic processes that govern the nation. The exchange then delved into the emerging role of artificial intelligence and high-frequency data analytics in monitoring trade compliance and detecting illicit transshipments. Senator Fisher challenged Ambassador Greer to explain how the Department of Trade is leveraging AG tech innovations to protect domestic producers from the predatory pricing strategies of foreign state-owned enterprises. She noted that in the modern era, a tariff is only as effective as the technology used to enforce it, especially when dealing with adversaries who use complex shell companies to mask the origin of their exports. The senator advocated for the creation of a digital border initiative that would provide real-time transparency for Nebraskan exporters, allowing them to compete on a level playing field where data, not just muscle, determines market success. Ambassador Greer responded by highlighting the administration's investments in blockchain-based supply chain tracking. Yet the senator remained skeptical about the accessibility of these tools for small-scale family farms. Senator Fisher further explored the geopolitical risk premium that is currently being baked into the cost of capital for American energy and agricultural projects. She pointed out to Ambassador Greer that the constant threat of retaliatory tariffs has made banks more hesitant to lend to industries that are perceived as pawns in the global trade war. This credit crunch, she argued, is a hidden cost of protectionism that stifles innovation and prevents the modernization of domestic infrastructure. The senator demanded a comprehensive strategy to insulate the American financial system from the collateral damage of trade disputes, ensuring that Nebraska's entrepreneurs are not penalized for the diplomatic maneuvers of Washington. This part of the dialogue underscored the interconnectedness of trade policy and monetary stability, suggesting that a security-first trade model must also include a stability-first financial component. The conversation then transitioned into a rigorous debate over the most favored nation, MFN, status and whether the current global order can survive the rise of value-based trade blocs. Senator Fisher expressed deep concern regarding the potential for a fragmented global economy where the world is divided into competing trade spheres, a scenario she believes would be disastrous for Nebraska's soybean and corn exports. She asked Ambassador Greer to clarify the administration's stance on the future of the World Trade Organization, WTO, and whether the U.S. is prepared to lead a democratic trade alliance that prioritizes transparency and labor rights over raw efficiency. The senator's vision is one of principled openness, where the United States maintains its competitive edge by fostering deep, multi-generational partnerships with allied nations while maintaining a defensive posture toward non-market economies. Senator Fisher also addressed the specific grievances of the livestock industry, focusing on the voluntary country of origin labeling, VCOL, and its impact on international trade obligations. She urged Ambassador Greer to seek a solution that empowers American consumers to support local cattlemen without triggering the same retaliatory measures that decimated the industry in the mid-2010s. The senator argued that transparency is not a trade barrier but a consumer right, and she challenged the ambassador to integrate this philosophy into future negotiations with North American partners. This segment of the hearing highlighted the difficulty of balancing domestic political demands with the strictures of international law, illustrating the tightrope walk that defines the career of a trade representative. Senator Fisher's advocacy for Nebraska's beef producers served as a poignant example of how local interests can drive national policy shifts. Furthermore, the discussion touched upon the human capital gap and the necessity of linking trade policy to a robust national apprenticeship program. Senator Fisher noted that if the goal of tariffs is to bring the jobs home, then the government must ensure that the American workforce is prepared for the high-tech manufacturing roles of the 21st century. She criticized the lack of coordination between the Department of Trade and the Department of Labor, calling for a unified economic readiness strategy. The senator's focus on vocational education as a component of trade policy reflects a broader movement toward holistic protectionism, where the focus is not just on blocking imports but on building the internal capacity to compete and win. She asked Ambassador Greer for a commitment to include workforce impact assessments in every major trade deal negotiated moving forward. As the hearing neared its conclusion, Senator Fisher raised the issue of environmental reciprocity, arguing that American producers should not be penalized for their higher ecological standards while foreign competitors are allowed to flood the market with cheap, dirty alternatives. She pushed for a carbon border adjustment mechanism that is designed to protect Nebraskan farmers who have pioneered sustainable land management practices. The senator noted that green trade must be a two-way street, where the United States rewards innovation rather than subsidizing global pollution. This argument represents a significant shift in conservative trade thought, aligning national security, economic protection, and environmental stewardship into a single, cohesive narrative. Ambassador Greer acknowledged the potential of this approach, though he cautioned about the administrative hurdles of measuring carbon intensity on a global scale. The final hour of the exchange focused on the psychological security of the American heartland and the erosion of trust in federal institutions. Senator Fisher spoke eloquently about the sense of betrayal felt by many in Nebraska when trade promises are made during campaigns but are forgotten once the ink is dry on a deal. She challenged Ambassador Greer to be brutally honest with the American people about the costs of decoupling from China and the sacrifices that will be required to rebuild the domestic industrial core. The senator's appeal for radical transparency was a call for a more honest and mature political discourse that treats voters as partners rather than subjects of economic experimentation. This moment of personal reflection added a layer of gravity to the technical proceedings, reminding everyone in the room that trade is ultimately about people, not just spreadsheets. In her closing remarks, Senator Fisher reiterated that her primary mission is to ensure that the Nebraska model of productivity and resilience is not undermined by poorly conceived federal mandates. She thanked Ambassador Greer for the rigorous debate but reminded him that the jury is still out on the long-term effectiveness of the current administration's trade maneuvers. The senator emphasized that she would continue to hold the Department of Trade accountable for every ton of soybean that is not purchased and every manufacturing job that is lost to regulatory oversight. Her parting words were a clear signal that the struggle for a balanced and fair trade agenda is far from over and that she remains a vigilant guardian of her state's economic interests. This final stance of watchful advocacy defined the tone of the hearing, leaving the ambassador with a clear understanding of the challenges that lie ahead. The dialogue concluded with a sense of unresolved urgency, as both participants acknowledged the unprecedented complexity of the global landscape. While the hearing provided a wealth of insights, it also exposed the deep ideological rifts that continue to shape the American trade debate in 2025 and 2026. The exchange between Senator Fisher and Ambassador Greer will likely be remembered as a landmark moment in the ongoing effort to redefine American capitalism in an age of geopolitical competition. As the Assembly adjourned, the focus shifted from the halls of Washington back to the fields and factories of Nebraska, where the real-world consequences of these high-level discussions will be played out in the months and years to come. The pursuit of a perfect trade policy remains an elusive but essential goal for the future of the Republic.